Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Ultimate Growth Experience. This is my new book review. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you guys about Professor Niall Ferguson's old book, Colossus, The Price of America's Empire. So Niall wrote this in 2004, well, published in 2004, you could say. And he wrote this to defend America's role as the hegemon or global hegemon or the leader of the international system, or also the international night watchman or the world police. So it's a very, you could say, a foreign policy book that is quite hawkish. And so Niall Ferguson uh, pushes this idea that actually, despite what a lot of the American academics, intellectuals, and actors in the foreign policy establishment in the United States may continue to claim that actually America is not an empire, that in fact it is the most powerful industrial country in the world, but it also has a far more liberal view of the world. So Niall says that's more of a facade, that the American policymakers have continuously pushed this idea that America is there to provide small nation states the ability to be autonomous, to be sovereign, and to control their own destinies. And Niall goes through all the way from, from the beginning of the United States, for instance, when they colonized North America to build what is the United States today. And then he goes all the way to the present. So he goes through, World War One, World War Two, the conflict with the Mexican governments during its history. And Niall tries to continuously push this idea that America is actually an empire. It is Colossus. It is imperial in its nature because it wants to shape the international system. He talks about the continued intervention of American governments into, for instance, Latin America, right? The Monroe Doctrine. And what Niall also continues to push is the fact that it is America's moral obligation to intervene in Iraq. I think if he wrote a sequel to this, it would be a far different story because obviously the Iraq War was a total colossal failure. But Niall provides, you could say liberal internationalist, a liberal hawkish argument that it is in the obligations of the United States to intervene in Iraq and try to set up a new democratic government in Iraq, and the fact that, in his view, George W. Bush's intervention was correct. And even if weapons of mass destruction was wrong, was false, it didn't really exist, but he says that because Saddam Hussein prior, for the last 30, 20 years, did not follow international law, international rules and customs, and abided by a lot of the protocols set up by the United Nations. And so Niall says that it is right for the United States to intervene. And also he says that it is in America's own interest to stay in Iraq and help Iraq nation build. As some of you know who follow my channel, I'm not a liberal internationalist. I'm a realist to the core, under the intellectual traditions set up by Kenneth Waltz, Stephen Walt, John Mearsheimer, and others. And so if I was there in 2003, 2002, I would have said no, do not go to Iraq, despite what happened under 9/11. But anyway, I think Colossus is a pretty good intellectual piece to be able to understand the morale and understand what the American intellectuals and what foreign policy thinkers and policy analysts were thinking about at the time in regards to Iraq. But simultaneously, I think a lot of people at that period were quite naive to believe that they can actually nation build a society. Francis Fukuyama, who is one of my intellectual heroes, he went from being a neoconservative internationalist to becoming a more of a Wilsonian internationalist, which is what he describes himself as today, that we need to be far more restrained in our foreign policy. And and I mean we as in the Western world, because all of us, including people in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the European Union, and other places, have assisted the United States a few times in these nation-building projects. But I'm not convinced by Neil's argument that the Iraq War was good and that toppling Saddam Hussein was necessary, because I mean, look at the consequences. When you look at it in hindsight, ISIS was created, um, Al Qaeda was empowered as a result of that. They created a vacuum, um, and I can see why a lot of people do not like Neil's work. I mean, I've been a follower of Professor Ferguson for a few years, and I like this book, The Square and the Tower, and his other books, Ascent of Money, and other ones were, I find entertaining, and sometimes I was like, yeah, there are some agreements there. Um, and in some sense, when I read this, Colossus was a book that was written as a sort of like a semi-sequel to his old book Empire, where he tried to defend some parts of the legacies of the British Empire. And this time he's trying to say, hey, America needs to be the liberal empire that preserves peace, that puts forward institutional frameworks for the world to emulate. Like the examples that he pushes for are like property rights, the rule of law, balance of power within domestic institutions, low corruption, transparency, open markets, free trade, and it's a very idealistic book that Neil wrote in 2004. And he wrote this to say that, hey, it is necessary to have an international empire, because without an international empire, it is far difficult for small nation states, particularly the ones in the Middle East that have a very high corruption, very low transparency of the governance system, and, or what Asamoah and Robinson defined as having extractive political and economic institutions. But at the end of the day, Neil's comparison between the current liberal empire of the United States and the British Empire that existed when they dominated the world, basically, prior to the United States being dominant. I don't think a lot of people around the world will be really happy about that, because America has done a lot of damage, and especially after the Cold War ended, they went to sleep, as what Kishore Mahbubani said. And reading this in hindsight, it just made me realize how naive a lot of the intellectuals were at the time about America's role. And now, Neil's book is, well, still relevant to look at in a historiographical perspective, and how he presumed how history would play out. Because in the book he talks about the European Union's threat to U.S. hegemony, and how a lot of Europeans were not happy about American interventionism and nation building, and setting up a zone of peace across the Middle East. And because the Europeans tend to be far more pacifist than American foreign policy makers tend to be. And actually, I'll just tell you guys one thing, is that after I read this book, I watched the 2011 debate, the Munk debates in Toronto, where the question was, does the 21st century belong to China? And the people that were on the pro side were people like Professor David Lee of Tsinghua University in China, Neil, who took the pro position of favoring China, and then the cons, who were Fareed Zakaria of CNN, and also obviously Dr. Henry Kissinger. And in that whole debate, which I will put in the link in the description, Neil goes against his whole book, where he says China is not relevant. Their GDP per capita is too low. Yes, they are growing, but they're going to be part of the international system. Or what Robert Zillick defined as a responsible international stakeholder, because they are part of this international system where we work together. Obviously, that didn't play out as he expected here. And it's really funny how Neil says, oh, the 21st century now belongs to China. And I think he stands by that. I've been listening to a lot of his Hoover Institution podcast too, where he says that you were entering a new Cold War with China. So it's totally different to what he said in 2004. But if anyone is interested in American foreign policy and how they were thinking and what they were thinking about, especially, by this concept of liberal institutionalism and integration, and you could say nation building of countries overseas. Um, but it's a very interesting book, and like as I read this, I can see why he made this argument, because the U.S. have had a few attempts at nation building that have succeeded. For instance, West Germany, Japan, South Korea is another example where it turned from a dictatorship to a liberal democracy. And so there have been some instances where interventionism led to a country or society which have emulated the United States and built its own institutions. But I think the rate of that is really, really low. And also, I think the final point that Neil made is that there are three things that's going to be a barrier to the United States being the liberal empire or Colossus. One is the economic implications. The second is the soft power. Like, does it have enough soft power? And the third is the will. I mean, does America have the will, like the British Empire, to want to go to other seas and nation build? And the fact of the matter is, Neil says no. A lot of the kids that come out of Harvard, Yale, and Stanford would rather work at the World Bank or work at Wall Street or start and become CEOs domestically rather than go on these projects or nation building projects or institutional developmental projects. Whereas people during the British Empire wanted to go to British India, wanted to go across Asia and spend their entire lives there after studying at Cambridge and Oxford. And so his view is that America is still the leader and it ought to be the leader, and yet it failed to follow its objectives, evidenced by the fact that Americans wanted to go immediately home after toppling Saddam Hussein rather than staying in properly. And yes, Colossus, The Price of America's Empire, this book here, is a good read, and I think anyone who's interested should read this. So, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I'll be doing more of these book review videos in the next few weeks too, because I'm really, really enjoying it. I'm currently reading Dr. Henry Kissinger's book on China, so I'm looking forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you for listening and watching The Ultimate Growth Experience.